Hey everybody, I'm Jay Scherr with Jay Scherr Business Consulting. We help entrepreneurs, business owners, and other leaders maximize their potential, build rock-solid foundations for their businesses, and create more freedom in their lives. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. John F. Kennedy said, "The only reason to give a speech is to change the world." Well, on today's episode, we're going to talk about the art and business of speaking, the power of communication, and how we can improve this critical life skill, the Speak framework, building a platform and a personal brand, and more. My guest is a husband to his high school sweetheart and a proud father of 3. He's a sought-after speaker who has spoken throughout the country to audiences of just a handful to arenas filled with 13,000 people. He's a successful entrepreneur, author, and host of a popular podcast. He's been featured on the Inc. 5000 list, Forbes, Entrepreneur, and the Huffington Post. He's also an all-around normal dude trying to make a little dent in the world. Please welcome the founder of the Speaker Lab and the man who's helping speakers find clarity, confidence, and a clear path to make an impact, Grant Baldwin. Grant, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Jay. Appreciate you letting me hang out here, and appreciate the kind words in the introduction there, and looking forward to our conversation.
Absolutely, as am I. And, since I was introduced to you and doing my due diligence and research and reviewing your content and listening to your podcast, it really has been incredibly insightful for me. It's been an eye-opener. It really has me asking some deeper questions about the approach that I take and how I show up as a speaker. So I know there's going to be tremendous amount of value that we're going to uncover through this conversation today. So I thought a good starting point for us would be for you to share with us what your favorite thing is about yourself and why that thing.
Well, my favorite thing is just the life I get to live with my family. You mentioned in the intro there that I'm married to my high school sweetheart. When we started dating in high school, I was a 15-year-old freshman. She was a 17-year-old junior. So I caught myself a cougar, and we dated for several years, got married, been together almost 27 years. We got 3 beautiful daughters. So it's me and a house full of women. It's the absolute best. And so as much as I love, being an entrepreneur and a business owner and a podcaster and speaker and yada yada, my most important roles are being a good husband, being a good father. So that's certainly the thing I enjoy most about my life.
All right. Well, that's a beautiful thing. So since you said it, being in a house full of women, what have you learned about yourself from being in that household, and how have you changed the way, if you've changed, how have you changed the way that you view the world being in that type of environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say, a few things that come to mind. One would be that my wife has always thought that being a dad of all girls has caused me to mellow out in some ways. And so I've always been pretty motivated, driven guy, and I think I still am. But when you have, I think when you have children just in general, I don't know if this is a gender specific thing, but when you have children, it just causes you to just question everything about life, and nothing like bringing a kid into the world to just cause you to say, like, what am I doing with my life? And so I think prior to kids, being super motivated, super driven, and again, I think there's still a degree to that, but I think it's just much more healthy and has more boundaries. And so I think that's certainly been a thing. I think that as our girls have gotten older, they're 18, 15, and 13, is helping them as they kind of make transitions into the real world and figure out kind of what's next for themselves. I think that's been super fulfilling, rewarding of helping them understand how to navigate that, how to think through like what comes next, what are the options, what are the possibilities, lessons that I learned or things I would have done differently that I can share with them, but at the same time giving them the freedom to say, hey, you need to actually fall and skin your knees sometimes. So I'll give an example. Last night our oldest daughter, who's 18, is really into graphic design, and so she's going to college later this year for to study graphic design, and she's working as a graphic designer for actually two different companies here in town, and they're kind of like small little businesses. And so she was running up against a deadline for a project, and she was just kind of dealing with the stress and the pressure of, I have a deadline and I'm not nearly as far along as I wanted to be, and what do I do? I said, hey, that's life. Like, one of the best things you can do is you got to over communicate to the client and let them know that if you can't make that deadline, there better be a real clear reason why, and you need to be proactive in communicating that, and share with them where you're at, and here's what the next steps are. And so I think just some of those like life lessons for them during this, is fun to share, and fun to watch them learn as they grow up.
Well, I'm guessing you probably get some interesting content to use as well in upcoming speeches, or at least some ideas on some things that you can explore more deeply through this process. So just out of curiosity, with three girls, 18, 15, and 13, has anything surprised you about the way that you navigate those differences in ages? So if you look at your 18-year-old compared to your 13-year-old, obviously a big span, there's lots of different variables there. Has anything really surprised you as you have gone through those different ages with them as their father?
Yeah, I think that age is definitely a factor. I would say almost a bigger factor might just be their personalities. And anybody watching, listening with siblings, you probably understand this for yourself, that it's bizarre and none of us quite fully understand it. I'm the oldest of three. My wife has a younger sister, and so think about our own lives of going, okay, I grew up with two younger siblings and same parents, same house, same life, and like just night and day different in personalities. And it's the same way with our own girls, of going like, boy, we are, we're together a lot, and there's nothing that we've dramatically done different in raising one versus the other, but each of their personalities are vastly different. So I think that that's something that we have to navigate and think through, of how do we nurture and care for and support this one versus that one. This one of them may be more emotional than another. One of them may be more stubborn and hard-headed. One of them may be more willing to push back and be more difficult with you. One of them may be more quiet and meek and timid, and helping them find courage and bravery. So I think it's interesting how, like, again, for each of us, just as human beings, we're all unique in how we were created and designed, and who we are. But at the same time, understanding as a parent of how to best support, champion, cheer for your child as they kind of figure out who they are and what they're good at, what they're into, what are they passionate about, and what are their skill sets, and why was this one really into this and the other two are not. So I think that's probably the biggest thing, even more than the age differences, is just the personality differences.
I love that. So I have an only child. I have a son who is 31. I grew up with two sisters, and I was in the middle, so I understand where you're coming from in terms of those personality differences, etc. Yeah. But I didn't necessarily experience that with my own child, right?
Yeah.
With being only one child, so it's interesting. And so, well, good. Well, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. So, I would love it if you would share with all of us a memorable or maybe a profound experience that you've had from your life that really has been instrumental in shaping who you are today.
Yeah. So one I would say would be when I was in high school, I was really involved in my local church, and my youth pastor had a really big impact in my life. And I was like, I want to do that. Like, that seems like a really rewarding, gratifying profession. And so that was kind of the path that I was on. And so I went to Bible college, and then was a youth pastor for a little while. And as a youth pastor, there were parts of it I liked, parts of it I didn't like. But one of the things I really enjoyed was speaking. And so I was on staff for a couple of years there, and the guy that I worked for was not the nicest of human beings. And so when my wife and I were we'd only been married a couple of years, and she was actually pregnant with our first child. And again, like we touched on, there's nothing like bringing a kid into the world that just causes you to say, like, okay, what am I doing with my life here? And so I decided to leave that job, resign that position, And at the time, my wife would have been like 4 or 5 months pregnant. We didn't like have any savings, didn't have another job lined up or any career path or anything. And so that was an incredibly pivotal moment and chapter in life where, we had a lot of well-meaning, well-intentioned friends and family. Like, okay, let's kind of recap here. So your wife's pregnant with your first child. She's halfway through this. You don't have another job lined up. You just left your job. It's not like you have insurance or a ton of savings or anything to fall back on. Like, hey man, have you thought this through? And I was like, well, crap. Now that you mention it and put it in those terms, like I thought I did. And so the long story short was I worked a variety of just different odd jobs. And for the next like a year or so, I just found myself kind of wandering aimlessly, just trying to figure out. I felt like I was having this quarter life crisis of like, what do I want to be when I grow up? And I felt like during that season, it was one of the more difficult seasons of just kind of figuring out who I was and identity and purpose and meaning and that sort of thing. But at the same time, it was also one of the more valuable things because the thing I kept coming back to was speaking. And speaking, again, was one of those things I felt like I was good at and wanted to do more of. And I didn't know, like, how do you find gigs and who do you speak to? And can you be a professional speaker? Is that a thing? Like, how does that work? And that really evolved to, getting into the speaking industry and becoming a full-time speaker for many years, and then getting into starting the Speaker Lab, the training company that we have now. But I say just that season of kind of wandering the desert aimlessly, like, man, what do I want to do now? And what does this mean? And that sort of thing. Like, that was a very difficult and yet pivotal moment in life.
Interesting. So you brought up two words as you were explaining this part of this season, if you will. One was identity and one was purpose. So when we think about identity, what was the identity that you had tied yourself to, and what were you challenged with? And kind of walk us through, if you can, what the process was of discovering what you really wanted to do. So you mentioned, of course, you kept coming back to speaking, but why? So what were you asking yourself at this time to get that level of clarity? So speak to identity first, and then getting clear.
Yeah, really good question. So I think the identity part was in large part because I had just gone to school to do this thing, and I'd graduated, spent 4 years, got the degree, got the piece of paper, spent a lot of effort, energy, and becoming a youth pastor, and felt like, okay, this is it, this is the thing, and then got into it. And was like, hang on a second, like this isn't necessarily what I signed up for, and several friends and colleagues and other people who were doing similar type deals, and I was like, man, we were all going to do this together, and now here I am kind of questioning whether I want to do this, and maybe this was just the path of least resistance. So I felt like it was kind of, am I insane to go to college for 4 years and then 2 years into it think, man, maybe I don't want to do this, And so I think that's really even influenced now with, with our oldest daughter getting ready to go to college, of helping her think through college. And that's the reality for most people is oftentimes what you go to college for, what you end up doing for some majority of your career, for some piece of your career, are usually two very different things. And, there's going to be certain careers that, you want to be an attorney or a doctor or a veterinarian or whatever, like you have to go to school. Like you got to jump through the hoops. That's just the name of the game. But there's a lot of career paths, like it doesn't necessarily require it. And you don't necessarily have to do it. So it was just a difficult season of kind of detaching myself and just going like, okay, if I did something different, is that okay? And kind of coming to grips with, yeah, actually that is okay. That's not it's not the end of the world. And then as far as like the purpose part of going like, okay, let's, play out that thought exercise of if I did something different, hypothetically, what would I want to do? And you're kind of, you're looking at a blank screen, you're looking at a blank slate, and you're going like, the options are endless. And so how do we start to kind of narrow down what that might be? And so for me, it was various conversations with people like, hey, what do you see? Like, what am I good at? What do you see that maybe I'm naturally good at that I just don't realize, or something that it's like, oh yeah, everybody's a good speaker. It's like, well, not necessarily. And so what are those things that other people might see in me? There's a couple different books I remember reading. I remember reading a book called 48 Days to the Work You Love by Dan Miller, who recently passed away. And he was a huge influence and mentor in my life. Another book was a book called The Cure for the Common Life by Max Lucado. And that was another one I remember reading. And just, again, some of these, like, helping you kind of think through, like, what do you want to do with your life? And when the options in the buffet is endless, it can be a little daunting. It can be a little bit overwhelming. And so eventually when I was thinking through like, what are things that I've done before that I was like, man, that came naturally to me. I really enjoyed that. I lost track of time and it was fulfilling and I could see how I could make a living at this. Like, again, speaking was one of those things that kept coming up on the radar over and over. But again, it was just that year was just a really difficult season. But I would say one other thing that I think would be just valuable for the audience is in that season, I kind of felt like at the end of time for whenever my time on this earth runs out, like, there's two types of regret. There's the things that you do that you wish you hadn't done, and we all have our fair share of those. And then there's the things that you didn't do that you wish you had tried. And I kind of felt like there's never going to be a perfect time to pursue a career or a dream or to start a business. And again, this is the case with anything. When's the best time to move? When's the best time to leave your job? When's the best time to start a family? When's the best time to whatever, fill in the blank? Like, there's no perfect time. And that was certainly the case then of, have a newborn. I'm not really sure what I'm doing with my life in terms of career and, yada, yada. All these extenuating circumstances that would say there's no way you should try to pursue a dream. Just play it safe and, default to the path of least resistance to the simplest thing. But also know, like, I may not get another shot to pursue this. And maybe this is the best possible window to try something like this. And so, I'm really incredibly grateful that, I took a shot.
I love that. I mean, what a great example to share with others, to share with your own children also, right? To be able to pursue something that you find that's important, that's impactful, that also you were taking a risk at this point because you could have gone down a different path and decided that this was something that you must do. I just curious as a side note before we continue the conversation, when you were going through this process and you were getting input and feedback from other people that you were surrounding yourself with, and they were sharing what they see in you, right? Some of your strengths, things along those lines. Were there specific things that were shared with you that just completely surprised you? Like, you see that as a strength about me? I've never seen that.
This is also, 18, 19 years ago or so. So memories would be a little fuzzy, but I think anytime you have something that is just like, but I thought everybody is a good communicator, or everybody is, a good leader, or everybody is friendly or outgoing and is good at building relationships. And quickly realize I'm like, oh, that's not necessarily the case. And again, that's not exclusive to me. That's the case with anybody and everybody. Everybody has things that you're blessed with, that you're talented at, that you're good at, that just come easier to you than to other people. And so I think identifying like what some of those things are that you're like, I'm again, not from like a bragging or cocky standpoint, like, hey, I'm just really, really good at this thing. It's like, no, like, I don't know why, I can't explain it, but this thing comes more naturally to me than other things. And there's other things that I'm not good at, and it's harder for me to pick up. And again, that's not exclusive to me, but that's going to be the case with anybody.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. So you decide speaking is what you want to do, and you start speaking. You start to develop those skills. So walk our audience through, just for some context, as we start to pull the timeline forward. What was that process like for you, really kind of beginning to speak, where you were speaking, how you were engaging with customers, clients, setting up those speaking gigs, etc. So let's go back to the early stages of doing that, and then we'll talk more specifics about how you grew in that role and what happened from there.
Yeah, so in college, I actually worked for a guy who was a full-time speaker, and so I kind of got to help a little bit behind the scenes with him on, the business part of speaking and contracts and travel, logistics, that sort of thing. And so I knew, like, okay, I think this is a thing. But again, like in college and just in general, kind of growing up, you don't see it on the traditional menu of career paths or career options. And so even whenever I decided, like, okay, I'm starting to come to the conclusion that being a speaker would be gratifying and fulfilling, but it's kind of like, well, now what? Like, what do you do? There's no place where you just go check a box and say, okay, send me down the speaker path, like, how does this work? And so, again, at the time, this was 18, 19 years ago or so, there were no books on speaking. There weren't really any, there weren't podcasts or courses or trainings. YouTube wasn't a thing. And so what I did at the time was I just found myself like Googling, looking up other speakers, finding other speakers, and just emailing them. And like, can I pick your brain? Can I harass you? Can I stalk you? And just asking them a bunch of questions like, hey, how do you do this? Because I felt like at the time I had the potential, but I needed the plan. I had the potential, but I needed the plan. Meaning, I felt like I was a decent speaker. I knew I wasn't the best. I knew I wasn't the worst, but I knew there was something there. I'd given a lot of speeches and presentations. I knew I was something that I was good at and enjoyed and wanted to do more of. But I just didn't know, like, yeah, but how do you actually book gigs? And who hires speakers? And how much do you charge? And what do you speak about? Like, how does it work? And especially in the speaking space, as is the case with a lot of things, is there's no shortage of types of ways that you could go about doing it. So, at the time as a former youth pastor, like I was interested in speaking to high school students and speaking in schools as an example. But there were also, people who were speaking in the corporate space and speaking to business audiences or speaking to nonprofits or government or military or churches. And like, there's no shortage of different types of things, but also recognizing like you can't try to speak to all of them. So for me, going like, okay, let's narrow down who I might want to speak to. I know, I'm not sure exactly what this might look like, but I know that are not interesting, but this and this are kind of intriguing. So looking for other speakers in that vein and in that lane that might be a good fit. So again, I found myself just emailing other speakers and asking them all types of questions. A lot of speakers were super nice and helpful. And learned a couple things and eventually started like emailing event planners and decision makers and just kind of cold pitching, and eventually started booking a few things here or there. And like, holy crap, like I can't believe this. We're doing the thing. And even as I was doing that, I might book one gig a month or one every other month or something like that. I was still like, this is nowhere near enough to eat or live indoors or provide for my family. So I was also working again at a couple different odd jobs as just a way to kind of a means to an end to just kind of provide and put food on the table and be able to take care of my family. But as I continued to book more and more gigs, then I could kind of pull back on the odd job stuff and focus more on the speaking. But it was it was just a slow process. It was probably, I think it took me about 1.5 to 2 years to go from 0 gigs on the calendar to the point where I was able to do it on a full-time basis.
Very good. So the types of speakers that you were reaching out to pick their brains, I mean, were you reaching out to like the Les Browns and the Zig Ziglars at this stage, or was it more local speakers, just people that were maybe in your community that you knew did this type of work?
Yeah, I mean, the speakers I was reaching out to were still like cold outreach. I didn't have any personal connection to them. But I think what's important is, and this is, again, not exclusive to just speakers, I think this is the case with any kind of career path, is not necessarily looking for people who are light years ahead of you, like you said, a Zig Ziglar or a Les Brown or Tony Robbins or whatever, but looking for people who are like a step or two ahead of you, because it also feels like, okay, they seem more relatable and they seem like, based on what they're doing, like, okay, I could do that, versus like, you know what, I think it'd be, I'm a decent basketball player. I'd love to play in the NBA. Let me just send a DM to LeBron and see what his feedback is. Like, LeBron's not going to answer my feedback. And even if he did, what he might share for where he's at versus where I'm at, it's just like, again, light years apart. Versus someone who, they're a couple steps ahead of where I want to be. And so that just feels a lot more relatable. And so those are the people that I was reaching out to, in part because I knew that their advice would probably be a bit more practical for where I was at. And also there's a greater likelihood that they were going to respond, because it wasn't that long ago that they were in my shoes. And so I got a lot of great advice. And I think if I remember correctly, like, not everybody replied, and that's fine. But a lot of people who were super helpful and just saying, yeah, here's some things I've learned. Here's some things I did. Here's some things I would do again or wouldn't do. Here's some advice. And at that point, though, it's up to you to do something with it, because I think that just in general, people are more likely to help people who are going to do something with it. When someone comes to and says, hey, can I pick your brain? And then they don't do anything with it, you're like, well, that was kind of a waste of time. But I'm way more likely, as I'm sure you are as well, Jay, if someone comes to you, they say, hey, can I get your advice on this? You give some advice, and then they come back to you a couple weeks later and they're like, hey, that thing you did or you told me about, I implemented it, I applied it, it worked or it didn't work, and here's what I found. And what's next? I was like, oh, great. Like if you're going to take action, I'm all the more willing to help you. And so I found that to be the case with a lot of people that I reach out to. If they give me feedback and I did something with it, like go back to them and tell them, hey, the thing you told me, hey man, it worked. I'm doing it. Thank you so much. Because they're also then at that point a lot more likely to want to continue to help you.
Absolutely. I love that. It just reminds me of the mentor-mentee relationship, right? We need to be a good mentor, but it's also important to be a good mentee. And if you have a mentor in your life, you know how important it is to listen and to take action and to follow up and to actually do the things that someone is teaching and instilling in you. I mean, otherwise, why would we be spending time together? So that's a great point. So as you were building your repertoire and really doing the reps, was there a point for you during your journey where you had any challenges with confidence or, geez, am I actually getting better? Did you have any types of fears that you had to manage through? And if so, can you just very briefly speak to that and what you did to work through those types of challenges?
Yeah, I think that any speaker, I mean, if they're being honest, has some level of imposter syndrome of like, who am I? Like, what am I doing up here? Of standing up in front of these people and someone gave me a bunch of money to stand up here and share something with them. And maybe you'd go to a conference and you'd see another speaker and you think, well, they're way better than I am. And it just feels, intimidating or daunting. And so some of that I think is, again, something that most humans just feel in general. But I think also it's something that you get a little bit better with over time. And I start to recognize like, hey, there are absolutely speakers who are much, much better than I am, but that's okay. Like I can still be great at what it is that I do and recognize that like, I can have a very successful career by absolutely being really, really good, but not feeling the need of like, I have to be the world's greatest, the greatest speaker that the world has ever known or anything like that. So I think just having a healthy self-awareness and kind of healthy view of yourself is important in the process.
Absolutely. So had you hired a speaking coach? Were there any specific, I mean, obviously you were reaching out to some speakers, right, to be able to get some insight and some feedback, but did you actually hire a coach or were you taking any classes at this point to really work on improving those skills?
Yeah. So one thing I did was one of the guys that I reached out to, he said, hey, I get asked a bunch of questions like this. And so I'm thinking about hosting a boot camp in Dallas. And I was living in Missouri at the time. And I'm thinking about hosting this boot camp in Dallas. We're going to have a handful of people come. Would you be interested? Yeah, absolutely. He said the price was $1,000. And again, like I said, at the time, only been married a couple of years. We got a newborn. I'm just trying to put, life together and keep things afloat. Like $1,000, he may as well have said it's $1 billion because I didn't have it. And so what I ended up doing is we were on vacation with my dad, and my dad had done well as an entrepreneur, but he'd really instilled in us, like, if you want something, you work for it, you earn it. And so he never gave us handouts. And so I remember we were walking along the beach and I asked him if I could borrow $2,500. And to his credit, he said, I'll give you $2,500, not as a loan, but as a gift and as an investment. I believe in you. And so I used $1,000 of that to register for this. I used some of the money for travel to get down there, and then used some of the money for my first website, which was a combination of like talking to a friend. And again, this was 18, 19 years ago or so, where websites were a lot more expensive to develop. It was a lot more labor-intensive process. I talked to a friend who developed websites, who was very good at it, but like was working for major companies. It's like, hey, I can pay you in Subway gift cards. Can you please do a website for me? How can you help me here? And so he was super helpful in getting that first website. And so just kind of like cobbled some stuff together there. But when I went to that boot camp, it was just a one-day boot camp in Dallas. I think the biggest thing that I came away from, that is also something that we really try to instill in students we work with today via the Speak Lab, is I came away with a sense of confidence and feeling like, again, I'm not the greatest speaker. In fact, no one even like stood up and spoke. It was more on the kind of teaching training about the business of speaking and how do you find and book gigs. But I think meeting other people there, meeting the main guy, this guy that I looked up to, admired, and respected, still like a close friend to this day. But thinking like, oh, like these people are just normal people. Like if they can do that, then I can do this. Like this is a thing. And I've found that theme to be true throughout my entire career. Times when you're kind of looking again the people that are a couple steps ahead of you and thinking like, well, they have some special secret sauce that I don't have, they have some special ability, or they have something that makes it easier for them, and then you get to know them, or you meet them, or you're around them, and you're like, oh, like they have the same fears and doubts and insecurities as I do, and they're making it up as they go, just like me. And I found that to be the case so often. And so I think being in that room in Dallas just gave me a sense of confidence, like, oh, I can do this. Like this is a thing, and I can absolutely make a career at this.
I love that. That's great. I think it's so important to be in rooms with people who are a bit further ahead than you, who can challenge you, but who can also show you what a path forward looks like, and who also can see your potential and help to coach you up. And I mean, if you're hanging out in rooms where you're not learning anything, or you're only spending time with people who are not any further ahead than you, then you're really holding yourself back. Now, if you're in that room to be able to coach others, right, to be able to pour into others, that's a different story. But I think the power of being in a boot camp like that, or a mastermind group, or some other type of program, is the learning, the pushing you to become your best, and showing yourself what you're capable of doing by pushing beyond that comfort zone each and every day. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. So I want to move the timeline forward a bit. So you write a book called The Successful Speaker. Mm-hmm. And in that book, you provide a 5-step roadmap, if you will, to really be able to start and scale a speaking business from the ground up. So let's first, if we could, why did you decide to write the book in the first place? Yeah. The time that you released that book, were there other books already on the market, and you felt that you had a very different type of message and a different voice to deliver at that point? What was really the impetus behind it?
Yeah, and so I went to that boot camp, and then for the next several years, really just kind of implemented it, wash, rinse, repeat. And so over the next several years, got to a point where I was doing about 60, 70 paid speaking engagements a year as a full-time speaker, traveling all over the country, gone 80, 90 nights a year, and really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun, and was able to speak to some huge audiences and some amazing audiences, see so much of the country, meet some amazing people. But also at the same time, I remember I had a speaker friend tell me one time that like speaking is a high-paying manual labor job, in that you get paid really, really well to stand on stage and speak, but you got to stand on stage and speak. And so you got to get a plane, you got to leave your family, you got to go do something. It's kind of like a surgeon. You know, a surgeon makes good money, but you got to show up and do surgery. And so at the time, I had a lot of people who were asking me like, hey, you're a speaker. That's kind of cool. Like, how would I get into that? And they were asking a lot of the same questions that I was peppering others with, years before. And so I thought, man, I wish there was some other type of resource here. And so we started doing some kind of coaching and training around the topic of speaking. And the early stages and iterations of that evolved into what became the Speaker Lab. And so the Speaker Lab is the training company I still own and run today, where we teach people primarily the business of speaking. Again, the same questions I was asking. How do you find gigs, and how much do you charge, and what do you speak about, and who hires speakers? How does it work? And so that was the core of what I was doing there. And so, we were several years into the business, and people were, again, asking me a lot of the same questions of, hey, yeah, but again, tell us more about this or that. And there's different coaching and training programs that we do, but at the same time, I also know like that may not be a fit for some people. And so the book was something that came on our radar, I think in 2019 or so. And so worked with a friend on the book, and tried to just kind of codify like what is the framework that we would teach. And so we came up with what you mentioned there, that speak framework. And I think at the time, I think this is still a little bit of the case, is like there's a lot of resources and books out there on the art of speaking. How do you deliver a great talk? How do you put together a talk? And presentation skills, that sort of thing. But there's not a lot of resources, again, on the business of how do you find and book gigs? And if you wanted to be a professional speaker and do this as a career, how does that work? And so that's ultimately what the book is about. So again, the book's called the Successful successful speaker, 5 steps for booking gigs, getting paid, and building your platform. And so, yeah, within that is the Speak framework that you mentioned. And so happy to dig into that.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and walk through that. And I just want to make a comment to everyone that's watching and listening right now. First of all, obviously, we're going to provide a link to this information in the show notes, but I would encourage everyone to make sure that you're taking notes here. You see me, I'm taking notes as we're going along here, and I do that, and I talk about this on the podcast, but it's important because not only do I want to commit this information to memory, but it helps me really distill my thoughts and to get, as Grant is going to talk about here, more clarity. So as I'm listening, I'm listening and I'm taking notes about the things that I think are important, things that maybe I want to follow up on, but also things that are going to impact and change my own career, my own life. So please make sure that you're taking notes. Make sure that you are re-listening to this episode because there is so much great information that's already been shared, and I know we're going to get into some good things right now. So, Grant, if you could share with us the Speak framework, and let's walk through each of those 5 steps and maybe an example with each one.
Yeah, and so the Speak framework, it makes the acronym SPEAK, S-P-E-A-K. And so the first part of the process, S, is select a problem to solve. Select a problem to solve. And we touched on this a little bit here, but the big mistake that a lot of speakers make is they tend to want to spread the net as far and wide as possible. And so who do I speak to? I don't know. I speak to humans. I speak to people. My message is for everybody. And okay, well, what do you talk about? It's like, I don't know. What do you want me to talk about? I can talk about anything. I can talk about, leadership or sales or hobbies or health or marriage or faith or marketing, and like on and on the list goes. And the reality is like you can't talk about all those things to all people. And so it's very simple, but you want to solve one specific problem for one specific audience. Solve one specific problem for one specific audience. And again, this isn't exclusive to just speakers. This is just true in business in general. Is the more that you try to do, the less you're able to accomplish, the less helpful you are. So one way we like to think about this is we tell speakers, you want to be the steakhouse and not the buffet. The steakhouse and not the buffet, meaning, Jay, if you and I are going out to eat, we're looking for a good steak. Like, we have a choice. We could go to a buffet where steak is one of 100 things that they offer and they're all mediocre. Or we could go to a steakhouse where they do one thing, but they do that one thing really well. So they don't do lasagna, they don't do cupcakes, they don't do seafood or sushi. Like, they do steak, and that is it. And so that's the thing that we want to be as speakers, is we want to be the steakhouse, not the buffet. Solve one specific problem for one specific audience. Again, this is counterintuitive because we think like the more things we can do, the more opportunities we will have. But that's not what people are looking for. Like audience members, event planners, decision makers, they're looking for people who are specialists and not generalists. So that's the first part, the S, selecting a problem to solve. The P is to prepare your talk. Prepare your talk, and ultimately be really clear on like what's the solution that you are providing to that audience and how you are going to provide that solution. Meaning, like, is this going to be in person? Is this going to be virtual? Is this going to be a keynote? Is this going to be a workshop? Is this going to be a seminar? Is this going to be like a 1-hour thing, or is this a 3-day thing? And so being clear on what's the solution that you're providing. The E is to establish yourself as the expert. Establish yourself as the expert. So 2 key marketing assets that you need. One is you need a website, which in this day and age, if you don't have a website, you don't exist. It's hard for people to take you seriously. And 2 is you need a demo video. Now, what is a demo video? I want you to think of this kind of like a movie trailer. So before any of us would go see a movie and sit through 2 hours of a movie, the production company or whatever is going to take a 2-hour movie. They're going to boil it down to 2 or 3 minutes. And within those 2 or 3 minutes, you have a really good idea of the plot and the theme and the genre and who's in it and the characters and yada yada. And the goal of the movie trailer and the goal of the demo video is to make people want to see more. And so you also have to remember here is that the event planner is in the risk mitigation business, meaning if I hire you, if I bring you and I put you up on stage and I'm going to give you a microphone, let you talk to my people, I got to have a lot of confidence that you're going to do a good job, that you're not going to say anything inappropriate, that you're not going to get us all canceled, you're not going to embarrass me in front of my boss or committee or board or company or whatever it may be. And so that demo video gives them some confidence in hiring you. So you need a website, you need a demo video. Next part, A, is to acquire paid speaking gigs. Acquire paid speaking gigs. Now, this is oftentimes the part we want to fast forward to. Like, man, just tell me how to book gigs, right? Like, I don't need a website, I don't need this stuff, but you need these foundational pieces in place first before you get to the stage of actually booking gigs. And when we get to this part about acquiring paid speaking gigs, this is where we want to be much more proactive rather than reactive. So the mistake that the speakers make here is thinking like, okay, I have my website, I have my demo video, now I just sit back and I wait for the phone to ring. And like, it just doesn't work like that. Like you have your website, it's beautiful, I'm sure, but like nobody else cares. Like your mom is thrilled. She's going to tell both of her friends. Nobody else is concerned about it. So at this point, again, we want to, rather than just saying like, hoping people magically find out, or even just like, I'm going to throw some social post up and just sit and wait. Like if you build it, they will not come. So you got to be much more proactive in identifying who are event planners that you would be a good fit for, starting conversations, when are their events, being systematic, following up, the basic things that you need to do to start those conversations and follow up, stay top of mind. And then the last part of the process, K, is know when to scale. Know when to scale, meaning people who are interested in speaking are ultimately like, hey, here's something, a message that I'm passionate about, and speaking is just a method to go about sharing that. And so people who are interested in speaking are also typically interested in coaching or consulting or courses or books or publishing or podcasting. And so, I think the mistake sometimes is like, we want to try to do all the things. I want to do all of them. But you can't do all of those things. So something's going to come first, something's going to come last. You got to be clear about how speaking fits into the mix of what it is that you want to do there. So again, I know I went through that fast there, but at a high level there, that's the process that we teach at the Speak Lab, teaching the Speak framework of how do you actually get booked and paid to speak.
That's fantastic. So I want to hone in on step number step number 2 of the framework, and that's on the preparation side. Obviously, they're all important, but just asking a question for clarity, the amount of preparation that a speaker should do, is there a point at which we can over-prepare? Clearly, we can under-prepare, right?
Sure.
Not being prepared at all, not knowing our audience, not knowing our material. But speak to that preparation piece and what happens. What is the right gauge to use for preparation?
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of it depends on the context in which you're presenting. Typically, the higher stakes of the event, the more energy, effort time you're gonna put into it. If you are you're going to some little coffee shop thing that a friend's hosting with 5 other people, and they say, "Hey, can you talk for 5 minutes about teaching this thing?" Like, you're probably going to put a little bit of time and energy into it, but it's not like you're going to spend hours on it. But if you say, "Hey, can you come give a presentation to Congress?" It's like, okay, I'm gonna need a minute here to make sure this is really, really polished and dialed in, And so some of it depends on kind of the stakes of the event that you're speaking at. But I do agree that there is that fine line between being underprepared and being overprepared, because one thing that we remind speakers of all the time is that you are a human talking to a collection of other humans. And so act like a human. And so sometimes what we'll see is where, like you described there, Jay, where the pendulum swings too far and a speaker's almost over-prepared and it becomes formulaic, it becomes robotic, it becomes like they are so deep in their own head and they are thinking about their next line, and I take 5 steps over here and I move my hands this way, and it's just like, it just feels fake. It feels phony. Like, you want a human who feels like a human up on stage, right? And so ironically, though, it is the speakers that are the most prepared that make it look the easiest. And this is true, again, with like if you see a good comedian or a musician or an athlete, and you think, oh, they're just naturally funny, or they're just naturally talented. And yes, there may be a natural amount of athleticism or charisma or whatever that is on display on stage, but also they've spent so much time behind the scenes working at their craft and their skill that it looks effortless to you, but it takes an enormous amount of work to get to that point. And so I think that the best speakers on the planet, and this is something that all of us can learn from, don't just say like, hey, I'm a good speaker, so I'm just going to get up and wing it and kind of shoot from the hip and make it up and hopefully it all works out. No, they spend a lot of time behind the scenes of, I'm thinking through everything that I'm going to say and the sentences and the structure and the stories that I'm going to tell and the transitions and my opening and my closing. And I really want to think that through so that by the time I get up, I feel a lot more comfortable. I feel a lot more confident. And that confidence is going to come across to the audience and make me more trustworthy and believable, and more likely for the audience to lean in and pay attention.
Yeah, that is so good, and I really do appreciate you sharing that. I'm sure that there are many in our audience who have seen a well-known professional speaker more than once at a venue, and some do exactly the same speech. They move exactly the same way. Their body language, everything about what they do, it just seems so incredibly rehearsed. Now, you don't or may not necessarily notice it. You probably would, because this is a space that you're in every day, but you may not notice it when you see them the first time. But if you see them 2 or 3 times and you start to see that, oh, at this point they're going to go move over here, they're going to put their hands a certain way, they're going to accentuate a certain word, they're going to say exactly the same thing. It, when I see that, I understand it, but I'm also a little disappointed, quite frankly, because I almost expect, and maybe this isn't the right expectation, but I almost expect somebody at that level to have a more organic relationship with the audience. And if it's a different group or a different organization, the energy may be different. The message may be a little bit different. So when you speak and when you're doing a certain type of keynote, do you use at least a good percentage of your a common repertoire, let's say, and then maybe change it up depending on the audience that you're speaking to? Is it a brand new speech each time? Does it depend? How do you determine?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the mistake that some speakers make, especially in the early stages, is feeling the need to do a new talk every single time. So a way to think about this would be like, let's say you go to a restaurant and you sit down, and imagine that you sit down and the waiter walks up and says, "Hey, welcome to our restaurant. What would you like to eat?" It's like, "Well, I would love to see a menu." And they're like, "Actually, we do something different here. We don't have menus. We cook anything you could possibly want." I'm going to be a little skeptical there because it's like, I don't know how good this is going to be if this is something you've never tried or made before, versus what's the signature dish? What's the thing that you've made thousands of times and that you have perfected? Like, I kind of want to try that. Like, I'm sure that you've really figured that out, because when you are cooking a dish for the first time, or you are speaking to an audience and sharing a story for the first time, you're making an educated guess. I think this is funny. I think this will make sense. I think this will resonate. But you don't really know until you get up in front of that audience. In the same way that I'm not a chef. I don't know how to cook anything. But my assumption would be like, as you're making something, you're trying it. It's like, okay, it needs a little bit more salt. We need to cook it a little bit longer. I think we overcooked it. It needs a little bit. It's too tart. It needs something a little sweeter. Like you have to test until eventually it's like, bam, we got it, we nailed it. Like, this is the thing that we want to keep making. So in some ways, it's kind of like if you go see your favorite band in concert, like you kind of want them to do the greatest hits, and like they can throw in a few new things, but you're like, I want you to do the thing that like we all know works. So for an event planner, it'd be a little risky for them for you to come in and say like, hey, I'm going to do a brand new speech. I've never given it before. I'm pretty confident it'll work, but we'll find out. Like, versus like, hey, here's this story that I've told hundreds of times, and even though it may be even though you've told it hundreds of times, it's the first time that audience has seen it. And so having that same level of energy and enthusiasm of going, I know exactly how to tell this story. I know exactly how to make sure that I have the audience in the palm of my hand. I know when to pause. I know when to extend it. I know when to make them, well, I know when they're going to laugh. I know how to deliver this punchline. I just know that this works. And so I think if you do that too long, you're correct that it can just get boring and monotonous for the speaker more so than the audience. And so having like new material, new stories, trying some stuff out, testing some material, I think that can be important. But just doing a new talk every single time you speak is definitely not a way that you want to go about it as a professional speaker.
Fair enough. So for someone who wants to really improve their communication style, their ability to communicate impactfully, to be able to speak in front of an audience, let's say maybe they don't want to be a professional speaker, but it could be a business executive, a leader, and they need to be able to give a talk to shareholders, or they just want to have a stand-up meeting with their team and be able to get their message across. What would you recommend? Obviously, the successful speaker is an excellent resource. What would you also recommend someone who just wants to get more comfortable and wants to build good communication skills?
Yeah, so a few pieces of advice. One would be something we touched on earlier, is that you can spend a lot of time beforehand really practicing, preparing, being ready. And so a lot of that just ties into your comfort and confidence. So think about this like when you're in high school or college or university and you have an exam coming up. You have a choice. You can just kind of like, I'm going to show up morning of, I'm going to kind of wing it, and hopefully it all goes well. But we show up feeling like we feel stressed, we feel nervous, we feel anxious because like we haven't done any work, we haven't prepared for it, right? Versus like, okay, I'm going to really spend the time leading up to it to study, to go over my notes, to review questions, to maybe do a study group or something. So I go in and I may still feel it's the butterflies and some nervousness, but I also feel a level of confidence. Like, no, I've put in the work. I'm ready for this. I'm prepared for this. And so the same thing is true with speaking. Is really spend the time behind the scenes, practicing, preparing, so that you show up and feel like, hey, I have no idea what could happen here, but I do feel a level of confidence going into this. So that'd definitely be one thing. Another thing that any speaker can do is to tell a lot of stories. As humans, we are drawn to stories. We love stories. If I said right now, Jay, let me tell you a quick story. Like as humans, we're all kind of drawn in like, okay, he's going to tell a story. Like, I don't know, is this going to be funny? Is this going to be sad? Is this going to be depressing? Is this going to be inspirational? I don't know, but it's a story, so I'm in. It's even interesting, like I'll notice our daughters go to the local church youth group. And so sometimes I'll go pick them up after youth group and I was like, hey, what did the youth pastor talk about tonight? And they're like, yeah. I was like, what do you mean? Yeah. Like you were just in there. What did they talk about? And they're like, oh, they told this story. And then they will tell in detail the story, like word for word. Because like for stories, like we just as humans, we're drawn to stories. We love stories. We can relate to stories. So tell a lot of stories. And the other thing I would say is to utilize any opportunity you can to speak. Now, it may not be like I'm giving a presentation in front of the board or I'm speaking in some big formal setting, but it could be the type of thing I'm hanging out with a group of people and they're asking me, hey, what'd you do over the weekend? And I could tell a story. I could practice telling a story and see like, okay, I'm telling the story and I can see like, hey, this part really resonated with them or this part didn't make any sense. So it could be in that type of context. It could be doing a podcast interview like this. It's just the two of us talking, but it could be the type of thing where I'm just going to try something here. And maybe I kind of practice the story a little bit ahead of time. And so I'm going to give that a shot. So look for those opportunities. You're in a meeting and you have a chance just to speak up, like take advantage of those opportunities that just help you to build some of that comfort and confidence. Because a lot of people are nervous about speaking. A lot of people are intimidated or shy about it. And if I'm in a group of either strangers or colleagues or friends or family or whatever, like I can be a little uncomfortable about that. But the more I do it, the more I start to build some of that confidence of like, okay, I said something and I didn't die and it's not the end of the world. And maybe this went well or maybe that didn't go well. But it starts to give me some more confidence to do it more often.
Absolutely. Great advice. I appreciate you sharing that. So you had mentioned before about as a speaker or as somebody who wants to get more involved in speaking, have a website, right? Have
Sure.
that speaker reel. And let's talk just very briefly about, and we can't go into too much detail, but about really building your personal brand as a speaker. So what are maybe a couple other things that our audience should be doing to be able to build their personal brand if they're either just getting started or maybe they're already doing, maybe 2 or 3 gigs a month, let's say, but they really want to focus on building that brand? What would you suggest that they do?
Well, a few thoughts. One would be, I think it's easy, especially in the early stages, to focus too much on a personal brand and thinking through like, I need to make sure I develop like the most amazing website and a ton of social media and blogs and yada yada. And we spend so much time like creating all this type of content versus doing the work of actually trying to find and book speaking gigs. So I think really spend the time on the thing that you're trying to do, which is book gigs, which means starting conversations, following up on those conversations, doing the things that actually book gigs. And people just assume like, well, if I just, if I craft the perfect blog post or if I put this perfect social media post then things are just going to fall in my lap. And it just doesn't work like that. Like you really got to be much more proactive there rather than just having some social media post. Social media is okay. I think you want to be clear on like what the goal of it is for you and also what where your audience is going to be. If you're going to speak to much more of a business corporate type of audience, for example, then doing a ton on Instagram Instagram may not do anything for you if your audience isn't on Instagram. So be clear on like what the goal with social media is, and make sure that you're aligning with a medium that accomplishes that. The other thing I would say is it's really, really important to build your email list. Social media can kind of come and go, but an email list is something that you own, that you can take with you, that's portable. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, they can all change the rules on you, but you, with an email list, you can communicate directly to your audience. So huge fan of just having your own email list in terms of building your brand.
Excellent advice. Thank you for that. So, Grant, as we are wrapping up our conversation, first, we have all of your links, a link to purchase your book, link to the Speaker Lab, a link to your podcast. We'll put all that in the show notes. My final question is this. If you were giving your one last talk, your very last talk, what would the topic of that talk be?
The thing that immediately came to mind, I don't remember the guy's name, but the book, The Last Lecture, I don't know if you recall that, is a professor, I want to say like somewhere on the East Coast, and he had found out he had some type of cancer and just had a limited amount of time left. And so I'm butchering the details of the story, but the gist is like he had young children, young family, and said, hey, I'm going to be retiring as a professor. He was a very popular professor. And so he dubbed this as like, this is my last lecture. I'm going to give this very last lecture. And then he was retiring. And then, fast forward, and tragically, he did pass away a few months later, if I recall. But the last lecture, he gives just all this kind of like life advice. And he kind of wraps it up by saying, kind of tongue in cheek, he's like, hey, this is a bit of a bait and switch, of here's what the topic was. And I was teaching you this, but ultimately this talk wasn't for you. This talk was for my kids. And so he talked about like all these life lessons that he wanted to share. But ultimately, like this auditorium is packed with students and professors and faculty and just peers and friends and colleagues who wanted to hear from him. And he's like, this wasn't for you. This is for, I wanted to pass on something I learned to my own kids. And so that was the first thing that came to mind. I thought that was really, really powerful and just a very inspirational story. So I know I think you can just Google The Last Lecture on YouTube. You can find the actual speech, the talk, but also I think it was turned into a book. But that was a great resource. So probably doing something that would tie back into my family and my kids would be cool.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And Grant, I want to thank you so very much for joining us today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you sharing so much wisdom, your knowledge, your story, and I'm just grateful for you. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
It is my pleasure. And for all of you, thank you for watching and listening. And I do have a quick favor. Would you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts? Let us know what you thought about this episode. As a matter of fact, while you're doing that, visit the Speaker Lab podcast and do exactly the same thing. I know Grant would appreciate that, as would I. That helps our podcast grow and expand our reach. And to listen to more podcasts, all you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com, click that podcast button, and until next time, keep learning and growing. Pick up a copy of The Successful Speaker and apply the lessons you learn, and we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.